Hi, and welcome back to Project Stargate. This is The Messengers with Mike Clelland, Part 2. Mike, we left off and you were talking more about your experiences with Kristen and some other experiences, which you can go ahead and continue if you'd like.
Sure. So I just actually, that happened in 2006, and she moved out of the town I was living in shortly thereafter, and I hadn't seen her in years. And I just spoke at a conference, and she was in the audience at the conference. I invited her to the conference. It was in upstate Michigan where she's now living. And I went back home, and so both my brother and Kristen and a friend from elementary school were in the audience. And let me tell you, that was kind of strange to have, those people. So one of the things that I did when Kristen was in the audience, I just told much, much quicker and really scrubbed it down so there wasn't much to the story. But I told the story of Kristen in the mountains. And from the stage, there were about 100 people in the audience, maybe a little less. I pointed Kristen out and I said, "Kristen, how am I doing? Is this accurate?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, this is accurate." So, and then there was a certain point when I said, like, I went crazy. Like I've been very clear, like after that event in the mountains between about 2006 and about 2013, like I feel like I spent like 90% of my waking hours wondering if I had gone insane. Like everything was happening, like everything was compounded, everything was like hitting me full on, and the synchronicities were happening, and that was happening more than anything. I was having owl sightings and some UFO type things, but the synchronicities that were happening were off the charts. And I said, yeah, I went kind of crazy in those years. And she knew me in those years. And so I called her out and said, "How's that? Am I accurate about that too?" And she kind of from the audience went, "Oh yeah, that's pretty accurate." I asked her if I went crazy, and she said, Yep, you sure did." So and I feel much, much more grounded these days. But that was a rough chapter of my life. Now, but in the break you said, let's talk about synchronicity and what that means.
Yes.
Synchronicity is a term initially it was coined by Plato. And he said, excuse me, that's not right. That's archetype. Excuse me. Synchronicity was a term coined by, sorry about that.
It's okay.
I'm blending my philosophers here. Was a term coined by psychiatrist Carl Jung. And he said it is a meaningful coincidence, a powerful coincidence that is meaningful to the observer. So, and he has some wordy definitions that I don't really have off the top of my head, but I would take a couple steps back. And for me, I'm not a clinician. I'm not a scientist. I'm not trying to be. I would say that a synchronicity is magic. It is a moment of magic. And I'm content with that definition. Now, there might be some pragmatic, materialist scientific types that would cringe at that, but I got no problem with that. That is a definition for myself. So I can share like a really powerful one that happened early on when I was starting the blog. I used to talk about this a lot, and I haven't talked about it in years, really.
Please go ahead.
When I was doing the initial blog, right, I said earlier that it was just going to be synchronicities, which I have some nice ones. They're cute and funny, and they can have a little punchline and stuff. But I also sensed that I had the orange flash story that I told you about. I'll tell that more completely here. Now, I was 12 years old. I was growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, and totally pleasant, like kind of Leave It to Beaver suburbs. And there was a high school football game on Friday night. That's what in the fall, that all the kids in the neighborhood would go to the high school football game. I was in junior high, but that was the high school I'd be going to in a couple of years. So it was about a little less than a half mile from my house. So it was an easy walk. So I was walking home from the high school football game with a friend. His name was also Mike. And I wanted to be home in time to see a television show. And he and I were walking home, and this television show started at 10 o'clock. It was a show called Kolchak the Night Stalker, which was the predecessor to the X-Files. The guy who created the X-Files, Chris Carter, said, the reason I created the X-Files is because I loved Kolchak the Night Stalker so much. It was about paranormal stuff. He was investigating ghosts and zombies, and Carl Kolchak was the lead character. And but But as a 12-year-old boy, wow, I loved this show. So I'm walking home with my friend. We pass a house in the neighborhood. That neighborhood is where our childhood friend Cindy, she lived in that house. It was across the street and down the block from my house. So as we're passing her house, there's this bright orange flash in the sky, like click, click, like God flipped the light switch. It was normal night, right? Normal night. God flips the light switch. Click. Sky turns rich, beautiful orange. Click, goes back off. Lasts a second. And we were both like, whoa, what just happened? And he's
Wow.
like, like we went through the little checklist. Was there thunder off in the distance? Was it lightning? What happened? And nothing made sense. And we both were struggling with, it was totally silent. There was no noise associated with it. So I know exactly the spot on the sidewalk where this happened. So I get to my house. He lived a little further in the neighborhood. I walk in my house. He keeps walking. And I enter the house and my parents are standing there waiting for me. Like, where are you? Why are you out so late? I'm like, they're angry. I'm like, what are you angry at me for? I'm here and it's 9:30. I told you I'd be home at 9:30. And they pointed to the clock and it was 11:30. And I know I left the football game in plenty of time. So I would be home at approximately 9:30. And it was 11:30. And this is way before 1974. This is way before there was any kind of, the term missing time no one was using it at that point. So, and then the next, and I was upset that I didn't see the show. And the next Monday at school, I remember sitting with Mike at the cafeteria and with the other kids in the from my grade and saying, yeah, something weird happened on Friday night. And Mike blurted out, my friend Mike blurted out, he said, yeah, we saw a UFO with lights and everything.
Dang.
And I remember him clearly saying that. And then I remember I am not going to address this. I'm not I don't remember seeing a UFO. I just saw the sky turn orange. So I was like, whoosh, I totally clammed up. Now I had that story all written up and it was all ready to go. It was like posted on the blog. All I had to do was click the little button that said post, right? I had a graphic. I took a graphic from Google Maps of Cindy's house with an X on the sidewalk. And this would have been 2009, March of 2009. And I am sitting there. I was sitting with my hands above the keyboard. Like all I had to do was like a few clicks and it would be live. The blog had been up for a few weeks at that point. And I was like, oh God, like I can't do it. Like I'm a coward. I'm not brave enough. And right at that moment, a ping came through on my email. And that said like, oh, I have an incoming email. And at the time I had like Facebook friend requests. I would get a ping. So I opened my email and it's a Facebook friend request. And it was from the woman, Cindy. I won't use her last name, but it said, Cindy wants to be your friend on Facebook. I hadn't talked to her in 35 years. And that was the moment she pinged me. When my hands were above, I had a picture of her house on the post. And she sent me a thing that said, Cindy wants to be your friend on Facebook. So I like took that as like, I got a hold of her right away. We talked and we were like, oh my gosh, this crazy thing. And we had, I said, here, I got to read this thing to you. And like, I sent her the text of what I was just about to think. She said, oh, that's neat. I have a bunch of UFO books. So how do you back engineer what took place? Why did she choose that second? Now here, again, synchronicity, owls, UFO sighting, what was going on in the moments before the event? Let's call it the synchronicity. In the seconds before, I was saying to myself, I am a coward. I am not brave. Ping, the event happens, the synchronicity where she reaches out to me. And then I have the bravery to put the post online. Like I got the kick in the head to put that post online. That was clearly the message. So, and I've got a lot of stories of that power.
So synchronicities, basically what you're saying about synchronicities is it's usually things that seem coincidental, which may or may not be. that are, but sometimes they're associated with either numbers or a general idea that seems to be a common denominator. Is that accurate?
Well, the people have number syncs, sure. So when you get in this little world, there's a funny term. This guy, Jake Kotze, he coined the term synchromystic, which I think is wonderful. Like he said, like this is synchromysticism. So that's like this event was synchromystical. That what just happened. Now, so yeah, there's number synchronicities. You go to a UFO conference. I think you would go to any kind of conference that has like new thought. You go to a yoga conference or you go to a ghost hunting conference. I bet you could ask anyone in the room, like, what's your number? And they would say, oh, my number is 333. I see 333 all the time. And the next person would say, oh, my number is 1234. I see that all the time. And the next person might say, oh, I get 1111. I always see 1111. It's like on the clock or on the, so the number sync, I think, is part of it. Now, the number sync is pretty elusive, right? Because clocks are going to say 333 twice a day. And, like you're randomly going to get, the receipt from your cup of coffee might be $3.33. So it's hard to, the joke I make, it's like tough to start a new religion on some of this stuff, but that, so here's a question for you. Do you have a number? Like, is there a number that shows up in your life?
That's a good question. And I haven't really noticed a pattern with numbers as far as I'm concerned, but my current spouse, Sandy, when we got together, we've noticed a lot of things that linked us together in ways we even know. All the way back to our families going way back, and where we were born and raised in another state. There were so many things that linked us together. And when I met my wife, we weren't really looking for each other. I remember just handing my phone off to her without even thinking about it, her putting her number in my phone, and we talked for months and months and months. And the coincidences that linked us together were astounding. I've had people suggest I write a book about it. Like, it's that crazy.
Yeah. This is very normal what you're saying.
It is. It's astounding and it's riveting, and it makes me wonder, could this be God's way of putting everything together?
Yep, I agree. Yeah, the way I phrase it is like, who's the grand chess player of reality, right? So there's this big giant chessboard and all the pieces are set up, right? And someone is like we can't look up and see the chess player, but the chess player can certainly look down and see us. So who's putting these chess pieces together? Who's organizing this grand chessboard? Now, some of the things are like, something had to happen 10 years ago in order for it to click into place now. Like someone's got a long-term, some of the coincidences I've dealt with are that powerful. There's a long-term game at play. Yeah, I totally see that.
And there definitely is a long-term game.
Whether you call it God or
play. Yeah, you're right. I agree with you. And it seems like even things that don't seem to go our way, sometimes there's always some sort of methodology behind the madness at some point that you realize. And I heard someone in church one time years ago say that 90% of the things we worry about never really come to pass, and the 10% of the things that do happen that we worry about, we usually have a way of dealing with it where we come out on top at least at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, as far as your books go, Mike, you've written 3 books, and I'm seeing here, The Messengers was your first book. Can you tell us a little bit about what's inside that book? And then go and tell us a little bit about your other books.
So the first book, The Messengers, is big. It's about 400 pages. And it's bigger than it should be. I kind of surprised myself when I wrote it. That book was written in a weird cloud of synchronicities. Like, okay, so I would be working on a chapter and I would like, oh, this chapter is just not right. I just need one more story. It doesn't have a conclusion. It just isn't flowing right. And then ping, I get an email and it's someone saying like, Mike, I have to tell you my owl story. And they have like the perfect owl story to drop in the end of the chapter. So that happened in ways that just seemed magical when I was creating that book. Like that book was hard work, but it fell together in this mystical, magical way that I just I'm astounded by. Now, I've talked to authors like, workaday authors that have written books, and they kind of shrug their shoulders and they kind of say, that's the way most good books fall together. Like any author will tell you that there's a power in the act of writing that can feel like that. So, early on, I was collecting these stories, and I kind of was, making the connection between owls and UFOs, and I realized that that these writings and these blog posts, like I had a lot of information that could turn into a pretty good book. So I tried to formally address the connection between owls and UFOs, which is pretty elusive, right? There's no easy way to sum it up. And I put it in a book, and I had there's a lot of chapters where I explore all kinds of things: owls in mythology, owls in the Bible, owls in synchronicity, owls in popular culture, like in movies and books and such. So, and then my own experiences are also woven in there. And there are hundreds of accounts from people in that book. And so I was making my argument that owls and UFOs and synchronicity are all intertwined. And in the second book, which is called Stories from the Messengers, what happened was, and this was heartbreaking, you talk to someone, right? And you've probably been through this, right? Someone contacts you, they have a powerful story, you talk to them on the phone, and like 6 hours have gone by, right? People have these incredibly rich experiences.
Absolutely.
And then it might just be an owl and a UFO is like one little part of a 6-hour story. So I listen to this thing, and then I keep notes, and I befriend these people, and I am grateful that they shared so much with me. And then when it comes time to put the book, like I can't put a 6-hour story in there. So I just say like, then, Joe saw a UFO, and then moments later he saw an owl. That's all they get. And so then that second book is these rich, complex, overlapping stories. And I to honor the people that have reached out to me, I tried to cover those as thoroughly as I could, and cover them in a way that was that did justice to the complexity of the stories. So that book is essentially 19 short stories, and each one of those short stories, some of them are like 25 pages long, so they're not that short, but they cover the complexities. And there's this thing that happens, which is almost a form of proof to me, where someone shares a story, and you've probably run into this too, I'm certain, where someone says, well, like, here's my story, but wait a minute, I got to back up 2 steps and tell you this other thing. But before I can tell you that, I got to tell you about this thing over here because it's important. And then afterwards, this other thing happened that connects into the first thing. And so these stories are like a tangled up knot of these things that are all connected, but it's baffling the reason why.
Would you say it's akin to like cause and effect? Like a cosmic rule of cause and effect, for lack of a better term?
Cause and effect is too simple. Like cause and effect that's like when you hit when you're at the pool table, right? And you hit the cue ball and it hits the other ball, and the other ball goes into a pocket. That's like 1, 2, 3. There's the cause and effect. It's easy to see. This is much more complex. It's more like a hurricane of synchronistic events that are all swirling around. And what's going on in the eye of the storm is what I'm trying to get to. If that makes that so less cause and effect and more like the logic of someone trying to research, tropical storms and hurricanes and things like that.
Absolutely.
I'm using that as an analogy.
Yeah.
But that's what my sense is. People are terribly confused in these stories, and they're like, I don't know what's going on. And that was my story too. Like, I don't know what's going on. And then the third book was, what happened was Richard Dolan published my first 2 books. He has since given me the rights back, which was totally wonderful and gracious of him. And now I own the rights to all my books. But when I did the first 2 books, he was the editor and he was the publisher. And he was like, I would talk to him late at night and I would tell him these stories that happened in my life. And he's like, Mike, you got to do a memoir someday. You really need to do a memoir. And I'm like, oh yeah. I feel like I'm like plate is full. And then I kind of thought about it. It's like, well, I already have a memoir. I wrote obsessively in the blog for, it was 10 years. So for 10 years, I wrote obsessively in the blog. And there's a little bit of a dip in because I started working on the Owl books, kind of took a little time away from the blog. So, but I had, like, my story was all in there, and some of the things in the blog, things were happening in real time. So you read a UFO book and someone says something like, well, 10 years ago, I, looked out my window and saw this strange thing. And mine was like, the blog post was dated, and I was saying, like, something happened last night. I'm freaking out. And that was the context of the post. So the blog format actually worked pretty well to get that urgency and that emotional intensity. And my own fragile state is right there in there. When I said, like, oh, part of the stories feel like they were written by someone who was worried they were going insane, which I was at the time. And so that book is interesting. That book is called Hidden Experience, and that book came out in 2019, just a couple of years ago. And it hasn't sold very well. And the people who have never had these types of experiences have read it, and they say, yeah, I don't know, I didn't get it. And then people who have had UFO contact experiences or who have had a wealth of paranormal experiences or psychic experiences will get back to me and say, oh my God, that book touched me at such a deep level. Thank you for writing that book. So I realize that book, that third book, is not for everyone. That book seems to be specially positioned for the people who have had these kinds of experiences.
Wow. Do you sell these books through Amazon, or do you sell them through your website? What's the best way for our listeners to get a hold of them?
Amazon is the best way. They're just print-on-demand books, which is pretty common now. And then they're also all available as audiobooks. So they're available as print books, Kindle books, or ebooks, and audiobooks. So I read 2 of the audiobooks, which was really tough. Wow. And then I had a voice actor do the third book, or which was actually the first book, which was the longest book and the one that I was most intimidated to try to read myself. And I realized, like, I'll never read a 400-page book aloud. That's just too, I'm just poorly suited to do that. So, and those are all, and the first book is selling very well. And that's where I point people, if they're interested in this stuff, go to the first book. If you like the first book, go to the second book. If you've had what you feel are similar experiences, read the third book, which is called Hidden Experience.
Your website, MikeClelland.com, is that, as far as is that your primary website, or you post all your recent information or new information?
Well, I'm actually posting it on a blog, which is called hiddenexperience.blogspot.com. But what you can do is just type in Mike Clelland, and then you just click on the link, and it just takes you right to the blog. Cool, man.
As far as you now, I want to get. There's one question I had for you that I've been able to touch on earlier in the first segment. As far as your experience in researching, and do you have any experience in the field as far as researching abduction scenarios or UFO sightings where there's a hot spot or various different types of paranormal phenomenon are happening, kind of like Skinwalker Ranch or like the Bridgewater Triangle, places like that where you have this hodgepodge of high strangeness and all different types of paranormal phenomenon. And what are your thoughts on that, if so?
Well, do you know Chris Bledsoe? He lives in North Carolina. Christopher Bledsoe.
I know of him. He's somebody I'm very interested in and having on a future program, actually.
He's a great guy. And so I met him before he really came forward in any kind of meaningful way with his experiences. They did a television thing for the History Channel on one of his cases. My sister was she lives in North Carolina, and I just was down at my sister's, and I just did the thing that I do. I just called him up and I said, hey, my name's Mike, and I'm, can I come visit you? I would love to meet you. And he said, sure, come on over. And since then, that was 2013. And in the last 8 years, his life has completely flipped upside down with a lot of stuff that has happened. So like, I mean, he's his own walking hotspot. Like wherever Chris Bledsoe is like, he's like, he is the Skinwalker Ranch in a way. Like the stuff just swirls around him. So, and I've seen things at his home. I've had like wild synchronicities in connection with him, unbelievably powerful. Some are so private, I just cannot share them publicly. But wow, I saw like a floating orange orb with his son in the backyard. And I remember I was standing in his backyard and he said, like we sit out here in the summer, and this was the springtime, and we sit out here in the summer on a nice night and we just look at the sky and we see things like, well, and it was nighttime he was saying this. We see things like, well, like that little dot over there. He just points to some little thing in the sky, and then he keeps on talking. And I'm like, what is that little dot in the sky? This little dot was like moving around, and I was with another researcher, and we who just happened to be at the house at the same time. It was really funny. And me and this woman kind of walked to the middle of the yard, and we're like, what is that thing? And she was very Southern, and it was really funny because she's like, oh, I'm getting the chills. And we were watching this little dot, and it was like snaking around in the sky. Those little water bugs that float on the surface of the pond? They have that funny motion.
Yeah.
They kind of liquidy. They kind of like take liquidy, slide forward and stop and halt and slide forward. And then they kind of zip fast, and then they stop on the surface of the water there. That's how it was moving. This little dot was moving like that. And I couldn't tell it was small, close up, or it seemed like it was big, far away. But, if you just glanced at it, you would never have noticed it. You had to kind of stare at it to see it was darting around. But like, Chris didn't even bother to turn his head. He had seen this kind of stuff so much. So here's this woman and I are like, having this profound, like, oh my God, we're like seeing the unbelievable. And Chris couldn't really be bothered to even turn his head. I mean, he was very interested, obviously, but it was so. Your question was, have I been to Skinwalker Ranch? I'm like, no, but I've been to Chris Bledsoe's backyard. And wow, let me tell you, that is a serious hotspot. So
it sounds like it's equally amazing place to witness this type of phenomenon, or various different types of phenomenon.
Yeah.
Have you what do you know about ley lines? Have you done any research on that, and how? Because some of these ley lines, I've looked at a map before where they have the theoretical lines where all this different types of paranormal phenomenon and anomalies happen. Have you researched and looked into that as part of to partly explain why certain things happen in certain areas?
I went to England. I've been to England a few times, and in both times I went on a tour with this woman named Maria Wheatley, who's wonderful. And she studies ley lines. She's a ley line researcher. She also does crop circle research, and she does research on ancient Druid stone circles and things like that. It's a really interesting woman. And I did like a ley line class with her. Like we went out there with the dowsing rods. And we went to an ancient circle. It's called the Rollright Circle. It's not as big as Stonehenge or as Avebury, but it's an ancient stone circle that's like protected. It's in this farmer's field. It's surrounded by sheep, and we walked in there with the dowsing rods and pendulums, and kind of she worked us, talked to us about how this all worked, how these energies work. So I have a very surface knowledge of ley lines, but there's people who have done ley line research where they basically walk the landscape with a dowsing rod, the same kind of dowsing rod you would use to find water. And then you can people have walked the whole length of England connecting these things so you can imagine, and this is something that's really strange, right? So you need a well in your yard, right?
Right.
Every town has like the funny old guy that like has his hickory stick, and he comes out there with a stick or something like that, or a little copper rod or something like that, and says dig your well here. That's how wells are dug, through magic. Like that's how it's done. Like nobody digs a well without picking the spot, and the way the spot is picked is you, in essence, contact the local witch, I guess, and that's like a funny little thing that's pretty interesting, right? And there's some thoughts where there's like what is called piezoelectric responses that can emanate from limestone and flowing water, and maybe that's what's affecting the hickory stick. And I'm like, wow, I don't know. I've had some powerful experiences with dowsing rods. So people can walk the whole length of England with these and follow these straight lines. So I've done a little bit of work with ley lines and stuff like that. And I've had some weird, powerful experiences with psychic impressions and putting a line on a map. I don't think these are ley lines, but I have had powerful psychic experiences myself, which I write about in my first and third books, where I have had these visionary experiences with lines on a map.
Could you tell us a little bit in detail, just a little bit at least, about some of those experiences? I find this very fascinating.
Oh, now this is tough, right? Because we're on a radio show and I'm going to describe something verbally. So I'm going to use words to describe something that would help with a visual. In 2009, do you know who Mac Tonnies was? He was a UFO researcher and author. He died when he was 34.
I'm personally not familiar with that individual. No.
Okay. He was a good friend of mine. We never met. I talked to him on the phone a lot, and he died tragically from a undiagnosed heart ailment at the age of 34. He was a great guy. And he lived in Missouri. So he when he passed, we had been talking, he'd been working on a book, and I did the illustrations for his book. But that didn't happen until after he passed. And he passed with it's my understanding, with a 3-ring binder on his desk where he was doing the final edits in red pen. So
Dang.
The editor took the book and took on his edits and did a little cleanup on it. But the book is short. I think it's like 80 pages or something. It's a wonderful book called The Crypto-Terrestrials. It's available as an audiobook, and I would highly recommend that to anyone out there. It's an audiobook or an ebook, ebook or print book. Mac Tonnies, The Crypto-Terrestrials. It's a really wonderful, beautifully written book. But so I get I get the book. I get the physical book in my hand. It arrives in my house. I think this was March 10th, 2009. And then that same day, I get a picture from Missouri. Someone sent me, "Hey, Mike, check this out. This is a cool picture." And it was this 28 owls on a fence.
Dang, 28 of them.
28 owls on a fence. It's a great picture. It's on the blog and stuff like that. I went crazy. This is another one of these things. I went totally crazy at this point. This is like Mike's crazy switch got flipped here. You'll understand why in a little bit. So I'm like, well, wait, how? So I kind of read the article and stuff like that about the owls on the fence. I actually reached out to the person who took the picture, a guy named Farron Fight from Missouri, and he got back to me right away and said, yeah, this is where it was. And so I had an X on a map, and I could put the X on the map, and I was wondering how far that was to Mac Tonnies' house in Kansas City, Missouri. It was 123 miles. 1, 2, 3. Earlier we talked about number synchronicities. I'm like, okay, 1, 2, 3. This is just using Google Maps, right?
Right.
So 1, 2, 3, 123 was number synchronicity between the owls and the dot on the map. Now, this is the thing I told you about before. I got to jump back. Earlier in 2008, I had a psychic session with this woman. I was like struggling. I was reaching out to psychics and said, "Can you help me in this? I'm like struggling." And she said, "Yeah." So she gave me these she goes into this kind of trance, and she's funny and she laughs and she says totally normal stuff. She said, "You should have more olive oil in your diet, and you should go to your health food store and you should get supplements. You should get an alfalfa supplement. You'll find this helpful." And then she says, "Do you know Byron, Wyoming? Do you know Byron, North Dakota?" I was like, "What? What is this? What does this have to do with anything?" She said, "I don't know." And so I looked it up. And so I had a little push pin. I looked it up on a map, and it was Byron, North Dakota. And it was just a little dot in a farmer's field. It doesn't make any sense. There's like a push pin in a farmer's field. Makes no sense why it's placed there, according to Google Maps. You type in Byron, North Dakota, boom, it shows up, Bryon. And what I found out since is that it is like a township. It's nothing at all. It's like the name of a township divider on the county map. And there it just shows up as this pushpin that Google Map just arbitrarily puts in its field. And she said, if you go to the point on the map and go 15 miles to the border, and then 15 miles further, we'll be there. She's kind of in a trance when she says this. I'm like, what does that mean? She said, I have no idea. I don't know what it means. There's a butte or something. And so I looked on the map, and that dot on the map was 15 miles, North Dakota, 15 miles south of the Canadian border. And I went 15 miles north from there, and I couldn't find anything, just farmers' fields and stuff like that. There was nothing to be found. So take a step back. I have the event in the 28 Owls on the Fence, Mac Tony's home in Kansas City, Missouri. And then I just said, hey, if I stretch that line out, I bet you it touches Byron, North Dakota. So I used Google Maps. First, I just laid a plastic ruler against my computer screen and said, wow, that looks really close. And then I stretched the map out. It took a few minutes to figure out how to stretch a line out that long on a map. There's a way to do it on Google Maps. So I stretched a straight line out. It passes cleanly over Mac Tony's house. So there's a pretty close enough that it was startling. So the map, the 28 Owls on the Fence, the Mac Tony's home, Byron, North Dakota, perfectly straight line, over 800 miles long.
Wow.
And they all three line up, weirdly, eerily close. So I don't think much of it. And I think, well, someday I'll have to go to Byron, North Dakota. There's like something on the border. So a reader, this is funny, these readers who turn out to be UFO experiencers, this reader who I befriended, I've never met him, but we've chatted many times online and on the phone. He's had UFO contact experiences. And he says, I put all this in the blog, the map and the pictures and my crazy rantings. So this guy gets a hold of me and says, Mike, you do know there's a Byron, Wyoming. I'm like, what? There is? So so remember, go back where the woman Anya Briggs in the psychic reading, she says, oh, you should have drink more olive oil. Do you know Byron, North Dakota? Do you know Byron, Wyoming? And it didn't make any sense to me. So big giant map of America. I was living in Idaho at the time. You take a straight, and I knew this scared me because I knew what was going to happen. As soon as this guy said, do you know Byron? There's a Byron, Wyoming. And I was like, oh God, this is going to happen. I know just what's going to happen. So if you take a straight line on a map and you start at Byron, North Dakota, up near the Canadian border, you stretch that line to Byron, Wyoming, which is a dinky little town just south of Montana. And if you extend that line further, all right, so this is map technology. You can zoom in and you can get that little line 1 pixel thick, right? And you can zoom it. You stretch that line out. This was like 700-mile long line. It passed through my house. I lived in a tiny little cabin in Idaho. Byron, North Dakota, Byron, Wyoming. You stretch a line between them and extend that out. It passes through my house.
That's a hell of a coincidence, Mike.
That is not a coincidence. That was that coincidence is the wrong word. Like that is a synchronicity of like that was meaningful to the observer. I'm the observer. I'm like lost my mind. Like, how was that happening? So I said, I looked at the map. Someone actually, this guy, someone who had UFO contact experiences said, remember what she said? Because I posted her audio excerpt on my blog. She said, you go from the dot on the map, from Byron, you go 15 miles north to the border. And 15 miles north of the border, we'll be there. So I measured it out. Byron, Wyoming is 15 miles from the Montana border. And 15 miles north is this tiny little range, mountain range, that rises from the plains out in dusty Montana. And it is called the Pryor Range. And the Pryor Range is partially on the Crow Indian Reservation. And for the Crow and Blackfoot nations, which are two reservations that are right there, the Pryor Range is the home of the Little People. And if you read the Little People lore, it's like leprechaun lore, it's like trickster lore, and it's eerily similar to they're described as like little 18-inch tall people. And I talk to people who have seen the Little People. So does this make sense? Like there's this huge set of lines on a map. And I'm like, oh, I got to go to the Pryor Range. I got to go there. Now I'm do all kinds of camping. I live fairly close. I drive a few hundred miles. I go to the Pryor Range in Montana, and I spent a few nights out there. I spent 2 nights, 3 days there. I was practicing my speech. And everyone that said, oh, you're going to the Pryor Range, they said, take tobacco. It's traditional there. You take tobacco, you put it in a little pouch, you just leave it in places for the little people. It's a recommended and understood gesture that the native lore requests.
Now, when you're talking about little people, Mike, if you don't mind me cutting in just for a second, are you referring to the ant people, or is this a different entity? Because I've heard the Native Americans talk about the ant people. Is this kind of the same thing, or is this something similar but different?
Similar but different. The ant people are in southern Utah and Arizona, and that's the Zuni and the Hopi tribes have myths of the ant people. And I think the ant people take, like in times of world crisis, the ant people take people underground to like wait out the cataclysm.
Okay, thank you.
And the little people sound like leprechauns, right? They come out, they steal things, they play tricks on you. They they're kind of angry if you don't like respect them. So that's straight up fairy lore from Ireland, transposed to the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, I've heard of something similar. I have a friend of mine who believes in. He's really into the whole Nordic mythology and whatnot, and I've heard him talk about these little people. They're kind of like akin to tricksters that live under rocks in like places like Norway and Iceland.
Oh,
It sounds very similar.
Very similar. Yeah, they're all over the world, these the lore of the little people. Yeah, but they're referred to as little people here. So I I went in there totally alone. I had no agenda. I was just going to walk around. It's not really any trails there. It's kind of, there's cattle herding there, and there's really no trail system. It's not like a place you go hiking, but at a certain elevation, you're above it's just open sagebrush. So easy just to walk around. So I just walked around there for a couple of days. But the first night I was there, it was nighttime, and the probability of bears in this range was very small, but as a habit, I took my food away from where I was camping and I just hung it in a tree with some string. And I wasn't too worried. The probability of bears was low, but this was a habit of mine. So I walked away in the dark, and as I'm walking away from where I was camping, and this is down in the valley where it's dense trees, and these are cottonwoods, which are pretty rough to walk through. They got a lot of tangly branches and stuff like that. So as I'm walking through, making my way in the dark, I come upon this little owl. Like there's a branch at my chest height, and there's a little owl that's called a saw-whet owl. You can look that up, SAW-WHET. It is the cutest thing in God's creation. It's a 6-inch tall owl with these great big huge eyes.
They are beautiful. I got it pulled up right now, Mike, and they are absolutely beautiful animals.
Super cute. Oh my gosh. And it was like right there, like arm's length away. Easily could have put my arm out and touched it. And all of a sudden I'm like, boom, I'm like staring at this thing in the dark. I got a little headlamp on, right? So just a little camping headlamp. And they're LED, so they give this weird glow, right? It's not like an old flashlight where you get this beam. It's like this eerie glow you get. So I'm standing, and this thing is in the eerie glow of my headlamp, and it's looking at me. And I don't know how long it lasted, maybe a minute. This thing's looking at me, but what was happening is I just froze. It didn't seem to be bothered by me at all, but what was happening was we stood still. There were little moths, little bugs would kind of like start collecting in the light of my headlamp. And the little owl would hop off its little branch and pluck these little bugs out of the sky, like out of the air, just like it would jump up 3 or 4 inches. So I'm like right there, and then the thing flies off. So I went there. I drove there. I was leaving little tokens of my appreciation, little bags of like the little tiny, like the size of a ping pong ball of tobacco. And I made a bunch of them, and just in cotton, and I tied them up, and I would say, like I'm respectfully traveling in your land, and I'm here to have an experience. I was straight up like, I want to talk to the UFO occupants. I want some proof that this is real. I didn't get that. No UFO landed, and no, that was my stated goal. That was my intention, but that didn't happen. But I had the closest sighting I have ever had to an owl, arm's length.
Wow.
So now this is where this is about. This is like my journey. This is how I'm wrapping my mind around this stuff. The night I got home from the mountains, right? So it's a long drive. I got home at night. It was a long drive, and I went to sleep. And that night, when I got home from the prior range, after 2 nights, 3 days, where I didn't see a flying saucer, but I did see a close-up little owl, I had a dream. Now, I used to do art direction for ad agencies and things like that. So I had a dream where I saw a beautiful poster, and I could zoom in on it. I could zoom right in on it. And it was of a raven. And the raven was on a bright gold background. And across this was written in big text I got perfect view of it. It was in Futura extra bold in white letters across this gold background that crossed right in front of a black raven. Really striking image. And it said, "Follow your heart." And so I can't help but think, starting a year before, with the 28 Owls on the Fence and Mac Tony's book arriving, and prior North Dakota and prior Wyoming and my cabin and the lines in the map, culminating in me going to the prior range, seeing a little owl, and then having that dream with the message, "Follow your heart." It's a raven. It's not an owl, but it was the Crow Nation. So a crow is very, it's a similar, it holds a similar place as far as a totem animal that the crow does, the raven does. So that's a story that goes nowhere except in my deepest part of myself. I trust the power of all those events culminating in the message of "Follow your heart."
That's a very deep and meaningful idea you got out of this. What seems to be a very elaborate experience. That's incredible, Mike. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm blown away. I've always loved listening to you on other podcasts, and this has just been riveting. What do you got going on now, or is it top secret?
No, I'm working on a fiction book, which is which is not top secret at all. It's going much, much slower than I had anticipated. A few years ago, I had an idea to do a comic book, and I wrote a little script, and I never quite got the gumption up to do a full comic book, and I shelved it. I talked to some people I know. I worked as an illustrator in New York City for a while, and I knew some comic book illustrators, and I kind of ran this by them and said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing a comic book." And they're like, "Oh God, don't take on a big graphic novel, basically, all by yourself, because it's too much work. You need to work as a team." And I was like, I'm not going to work as a team. I don't know anyone. I'm living in this little town in Idaho. But I wrote a little treatment for the story, and I pulled the treatment out a couple of years ago, and I was like, this is pretty good. Like, I think I should write this up as a story. And I'm working on that now. And the few people who've read parts of it are like, wow, I want to read the rest of it. So I'm working on a fiction book. I'm trying to make sense of, like, people have said, "Hey, you can write another owl book?" And I'm like, the first thing they say, "Could you write another owl book?" And I say, like, I got enough material. I could write 50 owl books, except it'd be all the same story. It'd be the same exact story over and over and over again. Like I don't need to write, the 3 books I got out, you stack them one on top of another. It's like over 1,000 pages. Like it'd be tough to write much more about owls and UFOs. It's all like, if I couldn't cover it in 1,000 pages, like I didn't do my job right. So the fiction book has been a little something I've been looking forward to doing, and it's much slower going than I thought. So.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what that's going to be like, Mike. In your own words, it's about time to wrap this up, but I'd like to, in your own words, I'd like you to close this podcast out. In your own words, what does all this mean for mankind?
Whoa. Okay. So yes, the big question. So here, I'll tell.
I'm sorry to pop this on you.
Oh no, I'm all for the big ones. I'm all for the big questions. Yeah. I'm totally bored when people are asking, like, what, like, the outline questions. Like, what that little thing? Let's go right to the heart of it. So I'll tell a couple questions. So first thing, someone asked me one time, like, how's your life changed doing this work? And I had to think for a second, like doing this work and collecting this research. And I said, I now live in a magical universe because of the work I've done. And now I'll also say I did a hypnosis session. A bunch of stuff showed up, and we don't have time for it. It's heavy, like all the stuff that showed up.
We'll have to have you back on another time because I'd like to hear more about this.
Yeah, but I'll tell you this. So, and I can do it by heart because it's like really had a huge impact on how I frame all this. This was in 2018, so this is fairly recently. So I did all the books and stuff before then. I have this experience in 2018. I wrote about it in my third book. But do you know Yvonne Smith? Do you know Yvonne Smith? She's a hypnotherapist in California. She does UFO contact research.
Is she like John Mack's successor, for lack of
sort
a
of? Yeah, they were very close. Yeah, they worked together.
I think I've heard of Yvonne Smith. That sounds very familiar. But go ahead.
Yeah, so she's very grounded. She's very well respected, and so I did a session with her, and a bunch of stuff came out. But what I did say in the beginning, before I did the session, she wrote my book. I said, Yvonne, when I'm under hypnosis, can you just like spring a question on me? Don't front load it with anything, but just like, I want to know what's up with the owls. She said, sure, no problem. So the session goes, and it's kind of winding down, and a lot happens, but at the end there, she just kind of like, we're talking about some stuff, and then she just goes, and Mike, what is your connection to owls? And for a moment, I'm kind of like, I'm kind of mumbling a little bit, and then I speak very clearly, like weirdly clear. Like hypnosis is funny. You kind of like, you whisper and you talk in these little chattery sort of sentences. But all of a sudden I was speaking very clear. She asked me, Mike, what is your connection to owls? And I said, the owls aren't important. Like I had been told it wasn't like me at all. Like I had devoted my 10 years of my life to like owls. So I said, the owls aren't important. The owl is a symbol on a door. The owl is the correct symbol for the door. But the owl is not important. It is the door that is important. We are on this side of the door in a tight, claustrophobic little hallway. And on the other side of the door is an infinite vastness. So that would be my answer. Like, what's the message to humanity?
That's better answer than I could possibly imagine, man. That's incredible. And it seems like that you have very good reasons for coming up with this conclusion. And I'm sure more, I'm hoping that as we all continue to look into these mysteries, as I said before, I think that all of us are an important piece of this puzzle. Mike, you're definitely a big piece. And the more we listen to each other to understand one another, I think the closer we're going to get to solving these mysteries. Mike, I can't thank you enough for being with us on Project Stargate. We'll definitely have to have you back on sometime. I'd like to hear about some of your more of your experiences, and thank you for being with us. Thank you so much for being with us on Project Stargate today.
My honor, anytime. It was a delight. And thank you. You know what's nice? It's nice to be able to sort of stretch out and tell these stories completely. Oftentimes you just got to tell half a story, and that never quite works.
Well, next, when you have some more story, if you come up with some more stories in the future where you want to tell them about it, you have a free and open platform on Project Stargate anytime. You're welcome on my program, and it's been a real pleasure and a blessing to have you with us today.
And thank you. It's been a joy being able to share this with you.
His website is www.mikeclelland.com. His blog is hiddenexperience.blogspot.com. This has been the experiencers, or not the experiencers. There you go with my absent-mindedness. This has been the Messengers with Mike Clelland here on Project Stargate. I'm your host, Mark Brenner, signing off. Next episode, we will have Niara Isley on our program. Don't miss that episode. She has a very riveting and somewhat controversial story to tell, and we're excited to have her on our program coming up real soon. This is Mark Brunner with Project Stargate signing off.